Raj and I, some of the co-creators of alphaXiv, I'm going to share a little bit about our perspective on how research has changed in the last few years, some lessons kind of building out and growing alphaXiv. As a quick intro of what alphaXiv is, today it's kind of a place where people will stay up to date with research. What we think is one of the best places on the internet to consume research, read papers, stay up to date with it. And in maintaining it, growing it for the last few years, it's been cool to see how our approach on tackling this problem of like making research knowledge discoverable has changed as like the quality of models has changed, right? It's like the way we've attacked this problem has changed. But what I want to do is maybe I'll start with a very unnecessary history of scientific communication and what tiny part alphaXiv has played in that, and then how we think that's going to look looking out into the future. So we'll start all the way. Well, maybe a bit of westernized history here, but starting with like what one of the first scientific journals looked like. This officially has been known as the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of London. These were these like semi-formal groups where you'd have like an editor who would basically put together like a newsletter of work. At some point, Isaac Newton was one of these editors. Obviously, a popular group at the time, but still far from what we would consider like a formal, maybe a formal journal. So this is indeed a very brief history because we're going to jump forward to the 1800s, where you have some journals that you'll recognize today, Nature, Elsevier. At this time, peer review as we know it was still not formalized. So this happened around 1950s, 1960s. There was no like one exact moment where kind of the process of peer review as we know it today was introduced. But at every step of the way, there was like some notion of assigning or stamping some quality to research, right? So here it was a little less formalized, and at some point this did become like peer review, where the volume of work became large enough that you needed some official way to, kind of some formal way to put your stamp of approval on the work, such that the rest of the community knew that this was some credentialed or valid work. So this was kind of the trajectory of, I guess, scientific communication as we know it today. Something interesting happened in the 90s, which was there was this physics professor from Cornell who started maybe almost a virtual version of what you consider as these royal societies, if you will, a virtual version, a mailing list of other physics professors and his peers that wanted early access to these preprints, right? So before they were finally accepted in journals, people wanted to kind of stay up to date with the research. And so this was one of the first websites on the internet. And today you'll know it as arXiv, which is a hugely important piece of scientific infrastructure, if you will. In the early days of arXiv, funny enough, even though today it's like a very accepted, highly thought of service, in the early days there was definitely a lot of backlash they would get, that allowing anyone to basically upload a paper would really result in a low bar for research. It would result in maybe more harm than good for the academic community. Obviously, now looking back, we know some of the most important works have been published in arXiv. A fun example of this was, maybe some of you have seen this, but last year in September, Nature puts out this paper, DeepSeek R1 incentivizes reasoning, blah, blah, blah. But all of us know it came out, really at the beginning of the year, in January. And so to kind of highlight that gap in terms of how important it is to have, truly fast and fast disseminating scientific artifacts. So yeah, I'll actually hand this part off to Raj.
Hey everyone, I'm Raj, also co-creator of alphaXiv. Great to meet you all. And yeah, Rehaan and I, we're both doing research together in the same lab back at Stanford, which is how I met him. And yeah, been really fun to kind of work together on this project. And I think, yeah, just to segue off what Rehaan was mentioning, around like, a few years ago, we started to see this explosion in AI research. And I think, yeah, it was completely enabled by arXiv. I think it really just, the flow of information was so much faster. I think even across other fields too, like people say that, like in like fields like bioarchive also helped like accelerate the development of like vaccines and whatnot. So, preprint servers, super important. And so in arXiv specifically, you're seeing this explosion in AI research, and that almost made us think even harder of like, there's all of a sudden so much more importance and attention in this space, but the tools and workflows around, discovery and application of research have largely stayed more or less the same with like, Google Scholar and like arXiv. It's while arXiv is kind of great as a repository, it's not really very conducive to like quickly finding relevant research. I'm sure some of you have gotten like the daily arXiv ingest emails, and it's like just really hard to sort through. And so we're like, it feels like it's a good time to like, just build better tools here. But initially, we didn't anticipate like the scale or anything of this. It was honestly just like we were both undergrads doing research at our lab, and our PhD mentors would assign us a lot of papers to read, and we were just like, a lot of these are kind of hard to understand, especially when you need to read a bunch of them in a short time frame. And so we were like, what if we just add like a discussion layer on top of an arXiv paper, so you could just like comment on top of a paper? It was a really simple idea, but it was just like surprising that something like this didn't really exist. And yeah, the arXiv team is very principled. Like they are amazing at kind of supporting this open science initiative, but like they're a little bit more cautious when it comes to like, supporting, external initiatives like comments and whatnot, because, they want to make sure they maintain that ethos, and, they're worried about, like very negative comments and whatnot. But as students, we totally saw the value of just like, hey, I have a question on this part of the paper. I should just be able to like ask it, and maybe the author or like other students or other, industry folks can like chime in and respond. So we started a very simple site. It was called, I think, was their initial version called arXiv Forum or something. We ended up needing to change the name, but yeah, it was very simple. It kind of, in fact, even back then, it wasn't even the PDF. It was like the HTML that we were using. It's not shown here. And so you could just like highlight a part of a paper, and you could ask a question on the right side. And so surprisingly, like such a simple idea, but our lab mates and like people on LinkedIn, Twitter seem to like it. I think like there's some great names in the field who shared it online, and then we managed to get like the authors of the Llama 3 team answering questions on their paper here. So it was really cool to see that there was actually interest, in this sort of idea. But I think when it really took off was when, we started analyzing a few months in, like what the sorts of questions people were asking on papers. And a lot of it was like, technical clarifications, or like, or somebody is like in a rush and they're just like, hey, quickly explain the paper to me, stuff like that, where it's like models today can obviously do a pretty good job. And so I think it was Gemini 2 Flash came out February last year, and we were like, hey, what if we try just like adding that on the site, right? Throughout, until this point, we were very hesitant to add anything AI related. We were always like, hey, the ethos of the site is like, it's a community, it's focused on the people. We don't want this to become slop or whatever. But like, I think we were just like, let's just test it out, see how it does. And like, we are also talking to a lot of our users, and some people were starting to say, hey, like like, how do I read papers today? It was the question we would ask people, and some people would be like, I would download the PDF from arXiv, upload it to like GPT, and ask questions. And we were like, okay, if people are already starting to do this, like, seems like that's the direction that the field is going, and we should just have an assistant on the site itself, so you don't even need to switch to an external site. So we kind of just added an assistant right next to the paper, and you could, again, like highlight a part of the paper. And I think the sort of theme that you'll start to see with a lot of our project overall is that, like, it's nothing like super technically novel or complex, but it's just like capitalizing really good workflows kind of matters, because, in this case, for instance, even though we're just using an off-the-shelf model to answer questions, like just having it on the paper just makes it a lot easier for people because they don't need to switch off, and you could like highlight a part of the paper and like at other papers. So we called our first tweet, it was like cursor for arXiv. So it's like, you could like mention other papers in your questions and whatnot. And so that went viral, and then that was kind of the start of the AI transformation of our site, and we've never looked back since. So, it's, as Rehaan mentioned, it's been cool to see as the quality of models improve, like the site also evolve over time. So Gemini 2 Flash comes out, we add the assistant, and then Mistral had a model that was really good at OCR about like a month later. And so we started adding like visual blogs on the site. They're like AI generated blog posts for every paper, and had like figures extracted nicely from the paper. And so, yeah, one of the next things was like a really good deep research assistant. So you can ask like really high level questions about, either do a literature review, or you see in this case, like asking specific questions about oral training. And then what's really nice is like our assistant can actually like pull in the relevant papers, and also use like our own tools like views and traction on alphaXiv when suggesting papers, and give evidence from specific parts of papers in its answer. So yeah, we started to, as we gained a lot of community traction, we had this like really nice feed on our home site, on our homepage, and then kind of this was all up until like 2026, and then now we started to see the last like year or so, like the era of agents and whatnot, and so people started to kind of ask us like, how can like my agent kind of stay on top of research? Like, I'm spending a lot of time in like Claude Code. Like, is there any way I could like use the knowledge from alphaXiv, as I'm implementing stuff? Because obviously the coding agents today are great at implementing stuff, but like what's kind of missing is like that knowledge database that we have on alphaXiv and the community signal. And so we kind of launched our MCP, which was received really well. And this is kind of the next big thing that we've been spending a lot of our time thinking about, which is like, what is research going to look like in the era of agents doing a lot of the work? So how is research going to be shared, discovered? And I'll let Rehaan talk more about that.
Yeah, so I think some of the themes we were kind of thinking of once people started coming to us with these requests was, okay, like an MCP server is great, like it's a simple way to query the database, but are there like other fun, interesting things we can do here? Maybe in the theme of thinking practically about a researcher's workflow, one of the things we started thinking about with auto research was, okay, we don't know where auto research is today in terms of like being able to make discoveries, but how practically can it be helpful for a user in alphaXiv today, right? So one of the angles we started thinking about was, okay, a lot of people have played around with the idea of reproducibility. Can we just make it really, really easy for a researcher to start with their paper? We already have the code base indexed. Can we make it easy to set up an agent that has this loop of, what your hill climbing here is, can you reproduce some illustrative claim of the paper? In a lot of cases, just get the code base running. And this was actually a huge hit. Like a good 5,000-6,000 experiments have been run so far in the last few weeks. A lot. So it kind of shows you, what are the practical things people are running something like auto research on a platform like this today. A lot of authors that are actually trying it out on their own paper before a submission. Sometimes they need to quickly get some artifacts and run some experiments there. A lot of last mile stuff in terms of a lot of benchmark papers, inference engineerings, stuff that's maybe less GPU intensive than like a training run. Obviously, when you're talking about reproducing a paper, it doesn't mean anything to say, hey, reproduce GLM 5.2 for me, right? That doesn't make any sense. Somewhere in the middle, there are those RL papers that are still pretty compute intensive. But we were kind of seeing a lot of attempts at reproducing papers that are in this final category of maybe things that are under 1,000 GPU hours to run, even less, which has kind of been very cool to see. And as a result, we've also had a lot of fun in terms of trying out different models on different reproducibility tasks and just sharing it online. People kind of like these comparisons. This is actually a fun one. This is self-distillation policy optimization. And we both models kind of spend some initial time iterating on getting the code base working. And then you get a nice observable kind of graph of it trying out different experiments within the paper. So here, every box is just like a different Git branch. In our way, this is just a nice way to visualize what the model has tried. I think as you have agents do more and more research, having a nice like observable way to look into this is going to be important. And so that was one aspect that people were kind of interested in. Most recently, like as of a few days ago, we currently have this competition with Hugging Face, where people can go, the community can look at ICML papers, deploy their agent on it, and there's this kind of shared space for agents reproducing actual research, right? So these are very early, like very early looks at how this might look like. I think it's very clear as agents do more research, what the actual artifacts and important artifacts of research might be could change, right? So you could even think about like the tree of experiments that have been tried, even the chats themselves being like containing like really important context over the experiment, right? If you talk about sharing what's actually important in research in terms of making it reproducible. So the reproducibility angle is something we care a lot about. But one final thing I want to touch on is, what about beyond that, right? Like, where are we in terms of agents being, actually being able to do research, help with the research process? Because, reproducibility is like one small step of what that might mean. So we've definitely spent our fair share of time, playing around with this concept, trying out experiments, seeing where they're good at, seeing where they fail. I think it's best to maybe share some cool papers and works on alphaXiv that we think, go into this in a little bit more depth than we've done firsthand. So I wanted to share some of that work. One is from Andrew himself here. This was published in January. I think there's some lessons which you see like, okay, the models have just gotten better at. And so there's some points where I'm reading this today and it's like, okay, less relevant. And then there's certainly some points here where, okay, these are still problems and might be problems for a while to come. So for those that haven't read the paper, and Drew, correct me if I'm wrong, of course, you're one of the authors here, I believe this was run with like Claude Sonnet 4, Opus 4.1, and a couple of the observations in terms of, okay, well, like why aren't we seeing models do more of the auto research workflow? There were a couple of points around, the models using maybe not the right libraries, some implementation things. To me, those feel less relevant today when you have a model like Fable 5 and Opus 4.8. There were some points around, and certainly ones I've observed firsthand and have observed in other papers that I'll share here, which are, I think it's best put in the paper that models will call Eureka very early. So when you give it a really, really hard task, it's just very easy for the model to say, oh, I've got it. And so, there's some tangential things here of maybe you can call it hallucinations over long context, or reward hacking. I think these are all in the same boat where you give ALM a really hard task, and over long context, it's really hard to trust the claims it's making on that. So this is one that maybe you can argue the models are getting better at, as they are on longer horizon work, and these are really tricky coding environments that they're trained on. But still, there's a lot left to be desired there. Another point which I think might pose a larger challenge here is the lack of an LM's lack of taste, right? So a lot of researchers will argue that the edge of a great researcher is, given a lot of ideas, being able to pick the highest leverage idea and kind of get your bang for buck there. So this is like a very subjective skill, first of all, right? Like, how do you measure this? How do you optimize this? But it is very clear that there are shortcomings, in terms of this is just not what LMs have been optimized for right now. And obviously, it's something the labs care a lot about. But I think it's something today even that that poses problems. And you'll see a lot of other papers discuss and analyze this in interesting ways. So one of our friends from Stanford, Chenglai Si, he studied this in this paper from last year called the ideation execution gap. So this is actually a pretty fun study where they take AI-generated ideas, human-generated ideas, and then they go get humans to actually go and implement these research projects. And what's funny is they'll have the humans rate these AI-generated ideas. Off the bat, they are scored much higher than human-generated ideas. But when they go to the experiment, it turns out the AI-generated ideas are actually just not that good. So again, it's a subjective study. I think it's done quite well, but it shows you that it's really hard to quantify some of this. One more recent paper, probably not a huge fan of the methodology here. I think it's maybe on somewhat shaky grounds, but shows that people are trying this idea of, okay, how can an AI hypothetically learn scientific taste? So what they do here is, you need some measure of feedback on what is a good idea and what's a bad idea, right? And then from there, you fit a model on this, and then you do RL on that judge model. But here, the way they quantify how one paper is better than the other is they'll actually take two papers from the same arXiv subcategory that were published in the same week, and then say, hey, which paper had more citations? And now I'm going to train a judge model to make sure that it gives higher weightage to the paper that had more citations, and that's the better idea. I think there's a lot of noise in that. They call this like RL from community feedback, but I think it shows you like all the different ways people are kind of looking about this in the open space. Obviously, this is problem 1A for folks at the frontier labs that, obviously, how can I get these models to do research? What some people will call recursive self-improvement. What I'll leave you with is this last paper, which kind of, frames this discussion as saying, like, hey, why are we framing this as, models being able to one-shot research tasks, and why are we not thinking about this as this notion of like AI human co-improvement? I think it's a really great position paper that's totally worth thinking about. As all these discussions come, especially a lot of the doom and gloom discussions about, okay, research is, AI is going to one-shot research in the next year. AI 2027 is going to happen, and there's going to be nothing left for humans. This paper kind of frames things in a more pragmatic approach, which is, okay, how do we think about designing AI that's good at working well with humans? And think about this might be a more productive and more practical framing of the problem. And so what a practical takeaway from this paper is that, it's highlighted here, which is that maybe measuring research collaboration skills on AI with new benchmarks and constructing, data here is an important thing for the community to prioritize, rather than, benchmarks that are just, okay, how well does it one-shot this task? How well does it work with a human to brainstorm, ideate, do experiments, and whatnot? So I think this is a really paper that's interesting for us here at alphaXiv too, because this is kind of how we've framed our platform today, which is it's ultimately right now a platform for humans to discover research and kind of adding tools to make their research workflows faster. So I think one way or the other, I think in the next few years we will see the researcher workflow change a lot. And yeah, I think it's exciting to be a part of it. And I'll leave it there, I guess.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Rehaan. Thanks, Raj. That was wonderful, right? And so much to think through, right? Like, right from like sort of how the workflow has changed already to like the limitations that you pointed out. I mean, I have a bunch of questions before we, let's say, open it up for audience folks, right? And we'll get to some of the limitations that you spoke about. But I mean, I would love to understand, for the benefit of everybody and even for me, right? Like, for example, Love in the audience was like, hey, why don't people just fine-tune models with scientists that already have great taste, right? So building on top of that, you all are folks who are like sort of seeing the day in, day out usage of like researchers across the world, the best of them to like sort of entry level researchers. What are some usage patterns that you're seeing which can sort of hint upon how the research workflow is already changing, right? And I think some of these you've mentioned in the session as well, which is you see auto research being used for the sort of last mile stuff, right? But yeah, I'd love to double down on what are some usage patterns that stand out to you, perhaps were surprising to you all as builders of the product.
Yeah, for sure. I'll give some initial thoughts, and then Raj, if you want to add there. I would say the first thing is how much researchers will lean on AI as a thought partner at basically every step of the journey. Maybe this is not that surprising, but actually, I think maybe to give an interesting answer here, I think it's very cool to see people outside of CS. So one of our advisors is like a arXiv moderator for physics, studied physics for decades. And like the other day we were talking to him, he's like, dude, I'm using Claude Code for every step of the research. And I'm like, wow. The arXiv scientific director, Stein Sigurdsson, we have known him for many years. He would have been the last guy I would have thought to get like not AI psychosis, but like very, if you look at his Twitter feed and then if you talk to him, he's a great guy, super smart guy. And I think it shows you how important models, using models and doing research are. He studied astronomy his whole life, against scientific director of arXiv. Every step of the way clearly is like, okay, from literature review to ideating to doing the experiments has been an important part of their research workflow. So obviously in CS it's maybe there's a lot of coding, of course you'd expect that. Very cool to see this in spaces outside of CS, for me at least. So Raj, if there's anything to add.
Yeah, it's definitely really interesting. I feel like a lot of the transformation that we've seen in kind of the coding software engineering world is happening in research, but just like there's a little bit of a lag. So that's always interesting to see. For instance, today I think there's still a lot of researchers who don't effectively leverage Claude Code, and it's only a matter of time before that kind of changes. But yeah, I think that's been one thing on kind of the flip side of things that it has been interesting as well.
Yeah, I think now that you mentioned that, another thing on just the paper sharing side has been how this, if you want to call it the attention economy for research, or how does one as a PhD student today really get their research out. I think that has changed a lot in the last few years. These days, I mean, it's surprising. We kind of sit at the intersection of this, for a PhD, how important it is. Obviously getting it in Europe's and ICML is very important. At the end of the day, that's like a poster session you get out of that. And how much traffic does your work get through that? Maybe not so much. Whereas, if you get a work that makes the rounds, I hate to say on a place like Twitter, that is really, really important for an academic. So you'll see academics kind of, for better or worse, in some ways better, really thinking about how can I make my research really accessible. So seeing how that has changed has also been, we've had a front row seat to that. Academics will, first of all, a lot of them will come to us being, can you share this? And a lot of times we are more than happy to do that. But investing in making a great first figure on your paper, a great Twitter thread, a great description of your work. These are maybe low effort, high reward things for researchers in terms of getting your work out. Whereas I don't know how important this was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, where maybe just a conference was the be all end all of sharing your work. So I think there's some elements of that have changed a lot.
Yeah, that's definitely. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, yeah, I feel like it almost feels like there's gonna be another big change here. I feel like what arXiv kind of did to the traditional journals, it feels like arXiv is amazing, but it just hasn't adapted yet to kind of the way research is actually being shared now.
Yeah, no, that's it. And I mean, fully aligned, right? That's one of the reasons we have a session on the future of research communication as well later. I think, both of you are going to be in it as well. So just building on top of that, I know alphaXiv also has a feature on sort of turning papers into blogs, right? And that's sort of right up there, right? So from your experience, do you find folks gravitating more towards that naturally, or is it more of you start with the paper, you do the Q&A, or other user cohorts for how research is being consumed, just different across these 2-3 different modalities?
Yeah, I think what's funny is blogs have been one of the best entry points for us in terms of this is something people will share. In a way, maybe that's because it's something more unique to alphaXiv than, okay, just the paper page itself. But a lot of folks, you'll see it, we'll hear, they'll find out about it because it's shared in the company Slack, or it's just, a quick way that someone's sharing the work. And then from there, if someone wants to engage deeply, obviously that's why the paper is there, and then you go back and forth. But it's been, I think one of the big hits with the blog was, I think Raj touched on this, was having it be very visual. So really taking the images out, spending time in okay, how can we make this, even though it is AI generated, how less slop can it be in terms of just making it very clear, making sure the model is not claiming eureka on the paper's behalf, right? So making sure the tone of it is good. I would say another thing is the translations have been huge there. So we offered in translations, and so those have made the rounds. I think it was a big reason why it's made the rounds in Japan and China, because those translations are there. One fun thing is we have an internal benchmark on, can a model take the LaTeX source of a paper and just translate the PDF itself? Today, that answer, even with Fable 5, is no. But one day the models will get good enough that we will have them translate the PDF itself. And then, I'm sure that will be a huge hit. But yeah, we're waiting for that day.
Yeah, no, that's sick. And another question, like just building on top of that, I think, and this is something that Raj and I also discussed, is like, you have like sort of audience from like across the world, right? Like you mentioned, Japan, China, etc. Are there any interesting differences in the way that folks use the product? And do you think tools like LLMs and LLM-enabled research tooling sort of bring these various geographies on an equal footing with respect to both putting research out as well as sort of just reading it and inferring from it?
Yeah. So I would say in the second part, certainly it's made it easier to understand papers. So I would say that's brought down the entry. I mean, for myself to just understand more papers, let alone everyone else. So I certainly think there's an element of that. In terms of different geographic patterns, that's a good question.
I definitely feel like there's more assistant usage among international audience. I think I've seen a lot of queries in other languages and the assistant where, it's my gut feeling is that I would expect there's more.
Yeah, I think there's like both social aspects aside and tooling, and that's probably a fair characterization that some of the assistant tooling has been more of international usage.
Okay, switching gears a little bit from usage patterns, right? I know like somewhere in the talk, one of you said that, hey, none of this is technically complex and these are simple use cases. But as somebody who's tried to build a bunch of these harnesses, I know it's fairly technically complex and not as simple as you all made it sound. So I would love to understand, and also for other folks in the audience, right? How do you sort of evaluate and benchmark each of your products, right? Like there's such a wide variety of use cases. There's so many different users and usage patterns. So yeah, we'll get some input.
Yeah. So on the assistant, on the alphaXiv side around all things paper reading, it's there. First of all, there's actually like no easy answer. Maybe that's an answer that some of these startups that do like agent observability might like. Like it's a hard problem. And maybe we ought to use some of those services. But I think part of it, us being researchers, helps a lot because we just use it. And so there's definitely times where we notice transgressions that, okay, it's not citing things properly, it's talking too much here. And so we're honestly always iterating on even small things in the prompt, tools, the model. So it's not an easy answer, but we're kind of constantly doing that. We have small set of maybe like 100 queries where we have some set of expected answers we want, and then it'll rejects or check that. But again, that can be very noisy. That can be very noisy as well. We do have upvotes, downvotes on the assistant messages. I think at this point there have been like tens, hundreds of thousands of those. We should probably use that more than we do right now in terms of assessing quality. In fact, I would love to actually like graph that over time and see how that's changed. The fact that we haven't done that though is, I think we're leaning a lot on our anecdotal experience, kind of using things there. Recently, there's a quality aspect and then like a latency aspect. So the latency side is obviously something we've spent a lot of time. Just you measure that, it's very easy. And there, by the way, that's something where we've started leaning a lot on like open models for, I think in the last month or two, in terms of they do great at paper QA, they're fast, with the right providers, they're reliable. So that's on that side. On the auto research side, also anecdotal, but we do like sharing a lot of our, anytime we see a cool paper, we will just run like multiple models on the same task and see what happens. And so it's very fun to see how, different models do at these tasks. And then we'll just share it online. People like, learn something from that as well. But yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. Right. And it's lovely to see that at the end of the day, LLMs, they're just so stochastic that when you're evaluating at the end, you do have to bring in your individual taste, like your individual sort of human judgment. And you all seem to be doing a great job at it from my experience on the product. So that's lovely. And how are the models doing on your evaluations and your harnesses? Like, I know everyone knows they've gotten better. But like any interesting observations on things that models could not do before that they now very clearly can, or even how are the open source models, let's say, matching up to the closed source ones?
Yeah, so I would say first on the second question, in terms of not like, again, putting some of the auto research stuff aside, the open models are absolutely for that use case good enough, because you don't need Fable 5 to do multi-hop retrieval. Again, paper QA. I would say paper QA, where someone just asking someone to understand the paper, is like one of the simplest tasks. The hard work is done in the paper, and you're just framing it to the user, right? So that apps, like we have DeepSeek V4 Flash as the default model, so super cheap, fast to serve, and it does the job well. In terms of some things, specifically open models can do now that we rely on that maybe were trickier a year ago. On the deep research assistant, or like the literature review assistant, doing this multi-hop retrieval, even honestly now has taken a lot of iteration to kind of get the prompt right, get the tooling right. And so what multi-hop retrieval is, so we have a corpus of say 3 million arXiv papers, and someone has a query saying, hey, what was this paper that did X? Or what are some recent self-distillation papers, or whatever. So what we'll do is we have like a search tool which kind of does full text search over the 3 million papers. And what an agent will do is it has that tool, and it'll be prompted to maybe do multiple turns of that. So it'll generate initial set of queries, look at that, do it again. So I think getting that flow down, it's gotten easier over the last year. But then I think there's some challenges in terms of, again, it's a subjective task. So nailing that is still something that takes some iteration.
Makes sense. So what I'm hearing is that the open models are more or less catching up, but like on some of these long horizon tasks, like especially let's say multi-hop reasoning, they seem to.
For our use case, like more than enough. You can even argue on these auto research, because these aren't like truly auto research tasks. These are like reproducing works. I would say like GLM 5.2 has been just as good. So yeah, I would certainly say open models are catching up.
That's lovely, and like I hope that's like sort of an input to everybody in the audience as well, because I feel like when we think of science and research, we sort of gravitate towards these private models, unless you're like really deep into it and you set up your own system. So yeah, it's great to hear from folks that are building at the edge that the open frontier is catching up. I do have a final question, right? But before we get to that, I'd love to sort of take a pause and check if you have any questions from the audience. And yeah, so I think we have one. I'll let you take it.
Yeah, for sure. So how do you differentiate from Claude Science, and maybe more broadly, like how do you differentiate from some of the work that doing recursive self-improvement is like absolutely priority 1A of many frontier lab companies. So I'll answer that in two parts. One, I believe Claude Science has been put out for basically Anthropic to collect as much data as they can about the research workflow. So this is the theme. They'll do Claude for X, take that data, learn from it, and then replace you, right? That's kind of the playbook for Anthropic here. I think one of the things that happened like a month ago was Claude, Anthropic had put out Fable 5 and said, hey, for research tasks, we are going to fall back. We're not going to give you the best possible model for research tasks, which is so ironic because now there's Claude for Science. It's like, which way do you want it? You need the data, but the goal will be for Anthropic to use these models, and at some point, not let any of the public use those models. The goal will be to train on research data and then use that to then build products like pharmaceutical drugs themselves and profit off that, right? So when you're an intelligence company, almost everyone's a competitor in a way, right? So for us, I think one of the things we think about is how can we accelerate the open research ecosystem in a way that when things like AI human co-improvement begin to really take off, the open research community is in a good place where some of the infrastructure around science communication and whatnot is not outdated. And I think the second part is, I think right now we look at ourselves, when you talk about like building a product around auto research, we've put stuff like this out. I think the form factor is subject to change. I think the actual workflows are going to be diverse. I think we're just interested in making sure like, how can this be the central place where these artifacts are shared, right? So however they're produced, we want alphaXiv to be the place where these artifacts are this is kind of the hub for that. So maybe when there's a world where agents start doing research, we want this to be a place where, okay, that's how they're being disseminated. But yeah, that is a great question.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I love the bit around like, hey, if you're an intelligence company, almost everyone's your competitor. And I
Yeah.
think this is also something that we called out in the Why LLMs Unscientist report, which is like
Right.
everyone's hiring all of these researchers with the
Yeah.
end goal of getting that data. And then then it becomes much easier to sort of imagine a future where you have autonomous science, like versus now. So that's lovely. I mean, building on top of that, Rehaan, I think you mentioned in your presentation briefly about how you think about the future of research artifacts, right? Maybe, maybe we can double down on it for a couple of minutes, because that's also a pressing theme for us at the conference. And again, like I said at the start, you all have been sort of building this infrastructure from day zero. So where do you see the future of research artifacts going?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one fun way of framing this is, if you guys are familiar with like Deep Wiki, I think there can be, in the simplest form, some type of like deep wiki for research, where just every important artifact that needs to be out there is out there. I think like right now papers miss a lot of implementation details. I think previously efforts around like reproducibility and collecting information about research and sharing it has been difficult. If you have agents that are carrying out some of the nitty-gritty work, and it's as simple as maybe having a scale or having changes in your prompt, I think that can, the artifacts can just look a lot different. So concretely, I can see this lineage of experiments that have been run be an important artifact of research. I literally think the chat histories can be an important, obviously maybe today they're interactive enough that people don't want to share them, but in the future where it is a 1 or 2 or 3 shot thing, sharing that and like the output of what the agent has done is super important, right? And so I think that can be an important part of what's shared. And how that looks like. But that's subject to change. The last thing I'll say is I think making sure that research is reproducible is going to be very important if we are going to have a world where like agents are publishing research, because again, they hallucinate so much. There's so much slop. Having a framework, and again, it can be an agent-based system that's verifying it, but having some system that's like, okay, I've run it on this set of GPUs and it works, and I was able to reproduce the numbers. I think that's going to be important.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks a lot. And like, yeah, fully agree, right? Like if you're gonna have agents doing a bunch of science, we're gonna have to like focus on reproducibility and just making sure that the traces are completely auditable and visible. I think we have a couple of questions in the chat as well. I think Vidit has a great one, which is that, hey, you're already doing great job on like sort of making research accessible. But it's still, like in my reading also, it's still a little bit of a specialist product. Like you have to be a researcher to show up on the platform looking for literature. So have you thought about how to like make research more accessible across like maybe, scientists to public, public science communication, or even going to schools and like,
yeah, I think, well, definitely, Raj, if you want to add stuff here, I'll say it's absolutely something we're interested in. I would say our audience has, while initially it was just academics, it's certainly growing to a larger audience of people getting into research. Like, I would say the most popular job title today is like research engineer or applied researcher, right? It's someone that was a software engineer, wants to get into research. That's a big part of our audience, right? It's people that are trying to learn. So things we want to do there, if you think about our feed, we want to allow authors to have like really short, nice descriptions so that people can grok it immediately and understand it quickly. I think there's definitely a lot of tools on the learning side that are maybe notebook LM-esque that we want to add as well. Raj, if you want to add stuff there. Sure.
Yeah, lots to share here. I mean, first of all, on the usage side of things, like, yeah, we've seen such a wide audience of people, like who are just interested in consuming the latest research. Starting with, obviously, we have like, the research scientists and PhDs, but yeah, a lot of people in industry who are like, machine learning engineer or just like SWE, or also we have like a fair bit of like VCs as well who are on here, like who are, maybe not always the most technical, but just, want to like know what they're, I guess, investing in. And so they're like trying to stay up to date with like the latest RL methods or whatnot. But we have even like some high schoolers who are trying to, read papers and get into it. I know I have a cousin who like they have apparently like a AI club already in their high school, which is crazy. But yeah, it's like, I think there's a lot of work we can still do to like cater to the different audiences, right? Like I think you could start as simple as like, obviously we have the blog, but you could even make the blog like, hey, explain it in like different levels to me, and you could select what or we'll learn from the user's preference how they want to read the paper. Also, Rehaan briefly alluded, like I think even the abstract today, it's not great, which is part of the reason why we created blogs. Like it's the abstracts are still often filled with jargon. Like one of the things we're thinking about right now is like making a new preview page for papers. So having like actually like really quick understandable explanation of like what the core idea of the paper is, and maybe that's something the authors provide, like and we can incentivize them to do that by saying that their papers will be amplified more or something.
Just take a final one and wrap up the session, and then we can hold back. We've discussed a bunch of things. We've discussed sort of, like the limitations of models, like how to evaluate these systems, how folks are using them right now. But in the spirit of the Conference for AI Scientists, where we're really trying to be forward-looking, would love to get a prediction from each of you on what do you see the future of science in, say, 2040, and where do you think the human edge will lie? As I think, all of us have agreed, we do see agents doing more and more science in the future. So yeah, what do you see the future of science being in 2040, and what do you think human scientists will be doing there?
Yeah. In short, I think a human's ability to intuit good research directions and be a great researcher, I think like that is the last remaining human skill that'll go before it's all taken away. Like I think once that gets taken away, then everything else is off the table. So I think for those that are interested in getting into research now, that's a good thing. I think that ability to have research taste and be a great researcher, that's going to remain relevant. I think in terms of 2040, I like to take the optimist view of what was shared in the AI human co-improvement, which is, hey, rather than this being a one-shot, somebody's going to come out with a eureka machine that's going to discover everything. I don't see that being how it plays out. Like, just look at how things are happening today, where even in the coding world, there's still a lot of a human needs to kind of steer the model. Many people have framed it as AI has gotten you one level up in this abstraction tree of work. So I think by 2040, a concrete prediction is maybe you'll see a lot of humans be the head of their own virtual lab, right? So you'll have an army of agents that can do stuff for you. You will be responsible for, at the end of the day, the results that are shared, where you take it. Yeah, I think this world where AI humans co-collaborate and get you to co-superintelligence is a future that's there. It's maybe very Neuralink pilled in a way that like at some point if the AI gets good enough, it's the human's job to kind of stay on par with that, rather than an AI that becomes all powerful and humans become like animals in a zoo. I'm not a big fan of that future. So
yeah. I think first of all, nobody knows the answer. It's like I think anybody who says they do is lying. But yeah, I think in the short, medium term, I think a lot of us can agree. Obviously, like the artifact of how research is shared is going to change. Like we've already talked about this. I don't think it's going to be a PDF. That may even change in the next few years. But in the long term, yeah, I think similar to what Rehaan was mentioning, I think humans are going to be like primarily responsible for deciding what problems actually matter and are worth spending the resources towards. And it almost feels like, communication and dissemination of importance of like ideas will really matter. Like why are the results that my agent got like more important or valid than, problems that you're sort of working on. And yeah, it's going to create interesting dynamics.